And it looks like we are back by popular demand. I know so many people were wanting to see what we had next when it came to the study of the Bible. It has been determined that we'll be looking at Philippians. So the letter that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi will be our next letter or book that we'll go through for here in the Bible. It's a pretty short one, especially compared to some of the other stuff we've done when it was in Revelation and Acts even was pretty decent, and Daniel was in good length as well. But so Philippians will be actually relatively short when it all comes to that. Probably only about 4 to 5 weeks as we go through the entire book. And I think it's going to be quite an experience. It really helps us be able to better understand the context in which a lot of what Paul was writing about, the world in which Paul lived in. And that's a lot of where we'll be coming from is from that historical context of Paul as we go through this, because a lot of times we like to look at Paul's letters and try to take a plain text reading and apply them directly to our lives today, and that was not Paul's intent. Remember, Paul was writing to a specific group of people at a specific group of time that had a lot of description and prescription for the church, but not necessarily always prescription for us. Though, as we all know, there are principles and ideas that we can take from that, but plain text readings is not one of those as we go through this. But before we really start digging into the chapters and the verses and everything, we're going to do what today is, for the most part, an introduction to the letter to the Philippians. And in my opinion, it provides a good historical and cultural context to the time that it was written. And we'll dig into that, about what Philippi was like. And we'll talk about that more as we go through from verse to verse, as we like to do. And of course, what Paul was up to when he was doing it. And so when you do that, when you look at the cultural and historical context of a letter like this, one thing you have to always think about it's a one-way message at this point. We don't get a reply back from the church. All we see is Paul writing based on a response, based on his response to information that he knows about that's going on in Philippi. We do not get a response or even hear what information he was exactly told that was going on. Now, we could put together clues and context and come up with our very well-educated ideas of what he is responding to and referring to, but no one ever really tells us. So you have to look at this. So what this does allow, though, is it allows us to open up probably multiple dimensions and perspectives that we typically would not consider if we were just to go into Philippians and start reading it without actually knowing or having an idea of what Paul was dealing with. So that's how we will be looking at this as we go forward. It'll be, I think, in my opinion, it'll be very exciting because I just love this sort of thing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to first look just at the city of Philippi. It was named by Philip II of Macedon, so Macedonian. He was the father of Alexander the Great, and I would encourage you to go back to read Daniel and some of the Old Testament works to be able to see exactly who Alexander the Great was and his role in shaping that part of the world during that time. So as any good, so we're referring back to Philip II, as any good leader or king would do, he of course named a city after himself. He built up walls around the city as a fortification against a group of people who did not like him, the Thracians, and so he was trying to keep them at bay, and so he fortified Philippi because, just based on my understanding of where it was a little bit higher ground. They were able to fortify it pretty well and keep the people in there pretty safe. So Philip took over that city about 356 BC. He recognized that there was that there was an abundance of gold in the area. So he spent a good amount of time mining that gold, and as you can imagine, made a pretty decent amount of money for himself and for his kingdom. Unfortunately, it did not last a very long time. Long enough for him, of course. So he did use his wealth, of course, his wealth of gold, to convince the surrounding Greek communities to, for the most part, turn on their own countries and to betray their countries. He would work with mercenaries and other people of ill repute and have them kind of turn on whoever he wanted them, because he would just pay them incredible amounts of money. So the city itself came under Roman rule or Roman authority during the middle of the 2nd century BC. For the most part, it was at the end of the Third Macedonian War, which was in about 168 BC. Just a little bit more information about Philippi. It was a strategic outpost for the Romans. It was on what they refer to as the Via Egnatia, which was a major Roman road that ran, my understanding, from the Adriatic to the Aegean Sea. And it was a place, of course, for easy access for people in and out, and also allowed it to become a pretty relatively, I guess you'd say, influential city. Near Philippi in about 42 BC was the battle that allowed the victor of Mark Antony and Octavian, who would be the future Emperor Augustus. They had a fun battle and victory over Brutus and Cassius. Those are the two who assassinated Julius Caesar. So if you know anything about that, you've probably heard of those names before. Remember that Roman colonies were ruled under Roman law. Not all colonies were ruled that way. And so, but they're ruled under Roman law, Roman constitution, city constitution for Roman cities, and for the most part modeled under the municipal constitution of Rome, which was actually, for many people, pretty good, especially for the people of Philippi, who was which Philippi, of course, was a major city outside of Italy, which allowed them to be under I guess you could even say the pleasure of being under the Roman constitution, which again gave them some privileges that people who were under Roman rule but not underneath that constitution did not have. And so this was actually a pretty good deal for those folks in Philippi. One thing that we also learned is that it was a military outpost, especially when Rome was in charge. And it seemed like after several of the battles in that area, a lot of the Roman soldiers would go and retire there at Philippi. And it pretty much would allow, as you can imagine, Roman soldiers were full of Roman pride. And so the city itself had a lot of its own Roman pride, and people were really just very patriotic, I guess is a good way to say, towards Rome there in Philippi. It turned it into an unofficial Roman colony. I mean, unofficial as in it was not in Italy, and unofficial as in it wasn't necessarily ruled by Romans, but it had the Roman constitution there, as I said. This led to, for those who were not Roman, so those who were either traveling through or ended up migrating there or immigrating there, were actually able to live underneath a actually relatively peaceful Roman rule. You could act as if, or say as if, they could pretend, I guess, that they were living in the motherland, Italy. Philippi, unfortunately, now is in ruins. It was, as we know, it's in northern Greece, near the border of Macedonia and southern Thrace. Its decline began probably around the 7th century BC, where its population diminished, and it, for the most part, became a small agrarian community. If you've ever traveled close to that area, it's referred to as, today, I guess, the city or the name of the town or that area is Kavala. And so you may be familiar with it. It's also known as, or was known at one point as, Neapolis. And it is about 10 miles southeast of Philippi on the Aegean coast. So if you recall, going back to, I believe it's Acts in the chapter 16 range, Paul is traveling to Philippi, and they end up going, of course, into Neapolis, which is, of course, there, that port city, and then, of course, traveling an additional 10 miles inland to go to Philippi. So a little bit about Paul, because he's the guy who wrote it, and it's good to know. Paul most likely arrived in the middle of the 1st century AD. At that time, it was referred to as we like to say, Colonia Lulia Augusta Philippiensis. So, yeah, I think Philippi is probably just a better way to refer to it as, but those Romans, they like to have their fancy Roman-like names. Like I said, it was a productive Roman colony whenever Paul showed up, but it really did not become a larger city until the following century, and I believe that's when Polycarp was there, and he reported some pretty good things we'll talk about here in a second, related to Paul's letters in the Philippi church, the church in Philippi. We know during Paul's time there was a population that was mainly Greek, Romans, Thracians, and even there were a few Jews based on, again, we'll learn about who is that, Lydia and the women there in Philippi. Most likely they would estimate there were probably about 15,000 people there in that city whenever Paul arrived, which, of course, decent-sized city. As most cities in that region at that time, there was a smorgasbord of religions for people to pick from, one, of course, being Jewish. But they also, of course, there's a lot of influence from Greek and Roman gods, Greek Olympians. There are, of course, local gods. Every town had its kind of own, group of local gods. There are also gods from Asia Minor and Egypt. And being the city on the road in which it was it allowed a lot of people from different parts of the world at that time to travel through, and of course brought their influence into the city as they would travel through. The imperial cult, so if you're familiar with that, especially if you've gone through Revelation, the imperial cult is the Roman emperor cult. So as we know, the Roman emperor believed that, or many of them believed, I'm not sure if they all did, but many of the ones we read about believed that they were divine. And of course, if you're divine, you have priests who help people worship you. And so the imperial cult also had a significant influence there in in Philippi as well. And so that was all part of the fun. And you could probably argue that the imperial cult, especially with the Roman soldiers there, was probably the more prominent religion of that city, and again in that region. It was a very, very powerful cult, and the other ones were probably all kind of secondary to the imperial cult. And so think about that. As we think through this, we can think with the letter that we'll be going through, that Paul sends to them, as well as the letter that he sends to the church in Ephesus and Corinth. What he's dealing with is he's not dealing with just people who were once Jewish and possibly becoming Christians, or people who had no other sort of religious background or spiritual background now becoming spiritual, but becoming spiritual as Christians. No, we're dealing with people who have a lot of influence from a lot of different what we would refer to as pagan religions now coming in, and he's trying to help them navigate that. And again, we'll get a whole lot deeper into that as we go through that. But you got to think that tension is always there in the background, just like we have other influences in our life that's beyond a Christian or messianic influence. They certainly did as well. So, of course, that will be a key topic. A little bit about the church in Philippi. There's a lot of discussion regarding the start of the church there in that city. Our best place to probably start is Luke's account in Acts chapter 16, where Paul makes his journey to Philippi. We believe this to be his second missionary journey that he takes along the way. As we know, Paul had a vision that he must go to Macedonia, which, of course, Macedonia is the region in which Philippi existed. And I would encourage you to go and read and study Acts 16 and surrounding chapters to be able to really get a full story of this trip that Paul was on as he travels to Philippi. So Acts travels to and stays in, and then eventually, of course, leaves Philippi. So go read Acts 16. Like I said, we actually did a study on Acts a couple months ago. You can find it out there on our YouTube, the Woodridge Baptist Church's YouTube channel, and you'll be able to get a good insight into that. Like I said, this was probably during Paul's second missionary journey, so we're dealing probably the late 60s AD, most likely some would say 58 AD or AD 58, which is right after he had left Ephesus. Paul meets Lydia there, and which helps, of course, begin the church in Philippi. We learn more about Lydia from Acts 16 and surrounding chapters, but we also learn a little bit about Lydia here. We know that she is a God-fearing Gentile woman, so she is not Jewish. one thing to keep in mind is that when Paul went into these cities, he would typically go to the synagogues. Again, we're going to point back to Acts again. If you read through Acts, you'll notice that anytime he went into a city, he went into a synagogue and started teaching the folks in the synagogue about who Jesus was. And eventually they'd either run him out of town or kind of listen to him and then run him out of town, but it never really went super well for him. But he continued to go into the synagogues as he went from city to city. It seems like there wasn't a large enough Jewish population possibly in Philippi for them to have a synagogue, and so he didn't go there first. It seems like most likely there is a makeshift synagogue or gathering of Jewish people, mainly of women, over by a river that was just adjacent to Philippi, and that's where they would meet, and that's where Paul went to go meet with them, and that helped start the church there in Philippi, and Lydia was a big part of it. Lydia, of course, is maybe not her real name, because Lydia actually is from Lydia. Her name, which means Lydian woman. So again, go back and read Acts, get a little more context on that. But we do know that a woman did exist there in Philippi. She did meet with Paul. She had a huge part in creating the church there in Philippi, and most likely was one of the leaders of that church whenever it started, after or before she actually left and went back to her home country. So she was someone actually would say that she was probably Paul's first convert in Europe. So remember, he has left Asia at this point and is in Europe, and so some people would say, or what we'd refer to as modern day Europe, and so that's what they would say, is that she was possibly the first convert there in Europe. After Lydia, of course, you know that we'll meet a girl who's referred to as the girl with the evil spirit, or the Pythonic spirit. We'll get more into that. She follows Paul and his buddies around Philippi, claiming them to be the servants of the God of the Most High. Paul did not need or want this attention, so he eventually calls the evil spirit out of the girl, which the owners of the slave girl, of course, are not too super happy with this, because, of course, they make a lot of revenue, and now Paul has taken away their revenue stream. Again, go to Acts, a lot more detail in that, but again, that all happens in Philippi, and it all has kind of a reflection on the letter that he writes to the Philippian church. So as you can imagine, as they're first of all making converts, but also secondly removing evil spirits, and then thus removing people's revenue, they were not super popular with the general population there in Philippi, and it of course became a bit more dangerous. The good news for them, and again, you'll see this in Acts, and you'll see this in some of his other letters, especially the one in Romans, the letter to Rome that was brought by Phoebe and taught by Phoebe to Rome. They were Roman citizens, and so Roman citizens had a lot of protection and from just getting beat up or thrown into jail without a certain trial. So again, that also allowed them to have, besides just not getting beat up and thrown in prison regularly, which they did, but there was some trials eventually, is that they had more freedom to kind of move around. And they were more than just some Jewish guys showing up and causing problems, which some people just said they were, but they were actually Jewish guys causing problems, but who were actually also Roman citizens, so that added a whole other level of dimension to it. So that's all we really have time now for Paul's trip to Philippi. We'll of course dig into that a little bit deeper as we go through the verses, but it'll be, I think, again, I go back to Acts. It maybe sounds like I'm repeating things, and I am, and because it's important that you know what else is going on. You can't just read Philippians on its own and say, oh, we know everything about what happened there. You need to read some of the other books of the New Testament and some of Paul's other letters to be able to really get a full picture of what's going on here and the way he traveled. Now a little bit about the letter. We're going to hit a whole lot more detail into some of this as we go to do the verse-by-verse exegesis, but of course I wanted to cover just some of the ideas and concepts and thoughts and themes behind the letter before we get too far along. It seems to be written by Paul with the help of Timothy. Most likely Timothy could have been his secretary. Doesn't have to be, but that's how some people have looked at that. It doesn't even necessarily have to be written by Paul. It could have been somebody who was a follower of Paul or someone who was a scribe or, again, like a secretary of Paul who wrote down this, kind of like what Luke did when you read Acts. But I think he truly did read it. He truly did write this letter, and I believe he did it from Rome, even though there's some debate from that. Some would argue that this was one of many letters that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi. Polycarp, who is the bishop of Smyrna, who is again there around in the early 2nd century, alluded to in his own letters to Philippi that Paul had written multiple letters to them, and most likely what happened is we end up with one of them. Now, some people say that there could be many letters, and this Philippians letter that we get, it could be a combination of some of those. There's, again, people with PhDs have a lot of debate about this, and I'm gonna stick with the idea based on the resources that I've read and some of the commentaries I've read that this is a single letter. But some people would say that in chapter 3 of this letter, it seems that there may be an additional letter being brought in or edited in later on. But let's stick with this just being one single letter. And the reason that, just because I know you guys want to know the Greek, the reason that we think that is, or think that it could be multiple letters that Paul wrote beyond just this one letter, not that they're all combined, we've already settled that, but that there are multiple letters that Paul wrote, is the usage of epistolae that Polycarp used when he was writing his own letter. So epistolae, as you can see, is multiple, more than one. And I think that's what he thought. And so if it is why not? Why they weren't put in the canon, we don't know, but maybe they were just lost along the way, and this is the only one they were able to keep. Anyways, so what we're seeing here, so most likely Paul was writing from a prison, just based on what you kind of see from some of the context in the early verses. Very possibly writing from Rome, which would put it around 62 AD or AD 62. Some would argue he was in Ephesus around AD 55, or Caesarea in AD 58, which is before he would make his way to Philippi. We know that Paul had been imprisoned in Caesarea. Of course, that reference can be seen more in the book of Acts. But his intro here refers too much to Caesar, and appealing to Caesar to make it seem like that could be the place. There's also little to no evidence that he was ever imprisoned in Ephesus. I mean, he got in a lot of trouble in Ephesus, and he was under Roman guard in Ephesus, but never really in prison. Not ever really. He just wasn't in prison in Ephesus that we have access or evidence to. And we know that, again, like he was under the protection of the guards because of what he did related to the pagan goddess Artemis. That whole exchange would, again, go to the book of Ephesians, and then, of course, back to Acts, and you'll be able to see more on that. But again, just the way the wording is there in that letter, it doesn't seem like he was imprisoned the way how this has been written. So we're going to stick with Rome. You can, of course, do more research, look into those other options. I encourage you to do that. But based on what I know, we'll stick with Rome. And as we know he was there for about 2 years. And it wouldn't have been a hard trip to have a letter written in Rome and taken to Philippi. It'd probably be about a 3-week journey. To us, that may seem nuts, but to them, it probably wouldn't have been a huge issue. A little more about the letter. Paul wrote this letter to help set up Timothy and Epaphroditus to help smooth the way for them. They were to be some of the leaders there in the church in Philippi. Any criticism or issues related were to be removed about them so that they could do their ministry. With any sort of church, as we know, or with a lot of many ministries, especially with people coming in and out of the city, sometimes rumors get started, sometimes lies begin, and criticisms start because maybe they disagree with something that Epaphroditus or Timothy or Paul said, and so, of course, people take sides. And so Paul is trying to keep that from happening. Paul also wants to show appreciation for the gift that the Philippians had given them. I believe there's multiple times that the Philippians had sent him a monetary gift, and so he wanted to show his gratitude to the church in Philippi for what they have done. As we go on, Epaphroditus not only, so he seemingly was the messenger between Philippi and Rome. So we know that he not only took the monetary gift to Paul, but he also took some news to Paul as well about what was going on in the Philippi church. And mainly at that point, it was the understanding of disunity within the church. And we can pick that up from what we read whenever we start digging through the verses in the letter to the Philippians. In his letter back to Philippi, again, Epaphroditus bringing that back after taking the news to Paul. Now he brings it back. Paul alludes to the persecution that was going on in the church at the time. They were in a place that persecuted them, but that was a place where they were to stay. That was the place to where they were to be the light. And we know, and based on what we know currently, is that where the church is persecuted is where it becomes the strongest. And when a church is not facing challenges or even some persecution, it becomes complacent, and which is, I think, what we see sometimes here in the West. But like if you looked at the church growth in a place like China, where not even the Christian religion is allowed, that church is growing exponentially. So there's that sort of thing going on here, and that's what Paul's encouraging them to do, is that, yeah, you're getting beat up on right now, but this is where you need to be as the light to the world. So you'll see as we read through the letter that he will tell them to stand firm or to stand fast and to not back down and to be the people of God that they were called to be. Excuse me. There's evidence throughout the letter, especially in the early sections, that Paul looked to the church in Philippi as partners in ministry. He had a deep affection for them and considered them to be brothers and sisters in Christ. As we know, Lydia was one of the first leaders of that church there in Philippi. Many others were there, of course, including Timothy and Epaphroditus, other folks we would meet along the way. And what we can see from this is that Paul had an ongoing, encouraging relationship with this church. Like I said, on multiple occasions they sent gifts to Paul, not only when he was in prison in Rome, but I believe when he was in Corinth and when he was in Thessalonica, they sent gifts to him as well as he was traveling on his other missionary journeys. Now we know that Paul did what he could as a tent maker or someone who works with leather goods to make his own living, and he makes a point of that in some of his other letters. But at the same time, just as any bivocational minister as he was, it sometimes was good for him to have additional funding from the Philippian church to help him continue his ministry. What we know from Philippi is that over time, the city itself actually, before, of course, its fall, it became a pilgrimage site for Christians. And most likely, the first basilica in the Balkans was in Philippi, and it was probably built around the 4th century AD. Let's look at a couple themes. And for the most part, that'll be it, and we'll be done with the intro, and then jump into the first chapter. Most likely not next week, but the following week after Thanksgiving. So there's a theme or two that I wanted to bring up. As we know, most likely Paul's in prison, most likely in Rome, but yet he is joyful in his suffering. He rejoices, or better said, he rejoices in his suffering. This is joy, or this rejoicing comes not from Paul, but from Paul knowing that God is central to his life, is what he knows from this. That the people of Philippi are to rejoice in their own suffering as they suffer under Roman rule and the oppression. I said that it was okay, it wasn't horrible to be a Roman colony, but there was still Roman oppression, because Pax Romana was all about, if you step out of line, we'll hurt you, kill you, and destroy your family. That's how the peace was kept. And so it was peaceful to a point, as long as everyone marched to the same beat. But as soon as you took a step out of line, bad things happen. Besides the oppression, there was a concern of a non-Christian influence or opposition to the congregation. Like I said, again, there was a large pagan population there, of course, a large pagan influence. We call it pagan. It sounds really negative. I mean, these people weren't like bad people. They just didn't know who the Messiah was. And so that was the point of the church in Philippi, is to help these people, or is to be people of God, so other people would want to be part of the church, to see that this is this love, this unity that they have. So they weren't going around berating and beating up on these other pagan religions or people who followed it. And I mean, there were some altercations, we do know that, but it was more about they were missionaries in their own land and trying to serve the people in which they lived amongst, which is what we're supposed to do as well. That's one thing you can take from this letter. Is that we are to be the people of the light amongst the darkness of this world. There are other issues that Paul deals with as he talks through this letter, writes this letter, and that's with traveling missionaries or traveling preachers. They didn't call them that back then, but they were people who would come and try to teach the Bible, or what we call the Bible, but teach Scripture, teach the rules of the road, the Torah, teach some of the teachings of Jesus, but they would not do it in a way they would take away from what Paul was saying and add their own, or they would mess it up in a way that would mislead people. There were many back then and continue to this day. They were not doing it to spread the gospel. They were using the gospel to benefit themselves, and typically in a monetary way. And so Paul is helping them avoid that. Through this, he offers models of believers, and one of them being Lydia, another being Timothy, Epaphroditus, of course, and himself. Jesus, of course, a great model. But he's showing those models in this letter as well. There's also the moral component tied to the mind of Christ that we see throughout the theme of this letter that they must be aware of. They're to be in communion with each other and with Christ, and it's to be a communion that is intimate and transformative. So the reason for remaining in Philippi as that church and for growing that church in Philippi is not for their own power, but to transform that city into a city of believers. And again, to this day is our call as well, as to transform, or not, we can't transform, but to help people transform into believers and followers of Christ. All right, that's all we're going to do today for the introduction. Next time we do this, it's going to be chapter 1. And I know we're not going to go through the first whole chapter because I'm going to try to keep these shorter as we go forward, probably half hour. So I used to do them and they were like an hour and 15 minutes. And for some reason, people don't want to listen for an hour. I don't get it. Anyways, we're going to go to probably closer to shorter formats and cover same amount of material, but we'll just spread it out over time. And that way, they're kind of in shorter bits and more, I guess, digestible pieces of information. So that's all we have today. Hope everyone has a great Thanksgiving. We'll see you later.